In a big fancy world where people have a lot of money, not everything is what it looks like. Jane is a young woman who gets married into a rich family, but this new life is full of secrets and lies. In a house where no one can be trusted, love turns into a game, and betrayal is everywhere. But when hate starts to look like love, who will give in first? In this story, every choice can be dangerous, and feelings are as wild as a storm. As the truth starts to come out, friendships change, and hidden secrets are revealed. Who will stay standing when everything falls apart? There are important lessons here. The dangers of being greedy, how strong a woman can be, how love can change everything, and how betrayal always has a cost. Get ready for a story full of surprises, where nothing is easy, and every moment is a new challenge. This isn't just a story, it's an adventure. Sit up and enjoy. Jane felt the sting of heavy slaps landing on her face, the sound almost reverberating around the room. "What have I done wrong?" she cried. Her father shouted, "How dare you question my order about who to marry? What do you have in this family?" His eyes were filled with coldness, and his anger was glaring from inside. This was not the first time Jane had been beaten for asking a mere question. She had wanted to know why she was being forced to marry when she had no plans to marry such a person. "Your little sister would be happy if she had this opportunity, but John's family specifically requested you instead of Miriam," her father said between clenched teeth. "You should be happy. You're not even qualified to marry into such a family." Jane retorted, "Is that so? I'm not qualified, yet they asked for me. Who are you deceiving? Can't you see that I'm no longer a child?" It was natural for them to protect Miriam. She was the family princess, while Jane was nothing but a second choice, only considered in the absence of the best. "If you don't marry Mr. John, I will make this house unbearable for you, and you will have no choice but to leave this house in shame," her father threatened. Jane retorted, "What shame is greater than marrying a man in a vegetative stage?" He raised his hand for the second time, but suddenly the door burst open and Jane's stepmother walked in with her usual fake smile. She stylishly held his hand and scolded him for hitting Jane. "Dear husband, are you still using violence? I thought we spoke about this before now." Jane felt like vomiting at the display. Her stepmother's words couldn't sway anyone, not even a day-old child. Jane's stepmother was her mom's half-sister who had lied against her mother and had her chased out of the house. Chasing her mom out was not enough. She wanted Jane out too. Her stepmother approached Jane and said, "Jane, I know you want the best for this family." Jane flinched as her hands patted her softly on the back. "Mr. John is our ticket to permanent freedom from lack. Don't you want us to live a normal life like we did before?" Jane was furious. She was suddenly being exchanged for their happiness, and there was nothing she could do about it. "If you both cared about me just one bit, you wouldn't be forcing me to marry a man I do not love because of money." "You better shut your mouth before I do it for you," her father threatened. Jane ignored her father and faced her stepmother squarely. "If you're desperate to be affiliated with Mr. John's family, you can, as well, get your precious daughter, Miriam, to marry him." Jane would have been extremely happy to marry the young master if he were whole, but he wasn't. After completing his studies abroad, a careless driver allegedly rammed into him some time ago. The accident was said to have left him in a vegetative state. Since then, rumors had it that he didn't have much time to live. "I don't want you to continue scouting for work without results, like you have been doing since you graduated from college. Marrying Mr. John will leave you wanting for nothing," her stepmother added with a fading smile. Jane gritted her teeth in anger. She could run away from the house, but her younger brother was still in the hospital, and his bills were yet to be cleared. Since it was already obvious that there was nothing she could do at the moment, she decided to give in to her father and stepmother's demands. Their threats were becoming more terrifying. and her brother's health was deteriorating too. Days passed, and soon it was time for the wedding. At the wedding, Jane could not see her supposed husband. She completed the wedding rites and, with a nervous and uncertain feeling, signed the marriage certificate. Jane was finally married to a total stranger, a man who was neither alive nor dead. The drive to Mr. John's family house was a weird one. The mansion was located at the top of one of the outskirts of the city, a place only the social elites could afford to live in. Suddenly the car came to a halt, and a servant appeared by the doorway. "Madam, please follow me." The servant led Jane upstairs to a room. The room was dimly lit and bigger than any room she had ever set her eyes on. Not that she had seen many in the past. On the bed in the master bedroom lay her supposed husband, Mr. John. He had a straight nose, sharp eyebrows, and a stunning face. He looked like someone who would be difficult to get along with. He was no doubt a well-known man, even though he appeared lifeless. His aura was oppressive, and Jane feared he would be quite dangerous if he wasn't in a coma. A pang of pity suddenly hit her at the thought that he would be dying soon and wouldn't be able to have a normal life like others. Jane's hand went for his brows, traced through his cheeks, and nestled on his parched lips. Even in his sleep, he looked so tempting, and she secretly wished he was awake on their wedding night. Suddenly, Jane felt him stir, and she quickly drew her hand away. She jumped up in shock and clung to a nearby window blind for protection. "I thought they said he's in a coma. Why is he suddenly wide awake?" In panic, she observed her supposed husband on the bed. Although he was wide awake, he still had the cold expression he had while in a coma. Just then, someone knocked on the door and Jane rushed to open it, eager to have another person in the room besides her vegetative husband. "I think Mr. John is awake. He has opened his eyes," she said to the young maid. The young maid gave Jane a disdainful look before answering, "You shouldn't be playing around here. This is not some fun park for kids." "But I wasn't playing around. I just saw him open his eyes before your knock came." "Take care of the young master and stop being so jumpy," the maid replied. The maid was about to leave when Jane suddenly drew her back. "Please, can I get another place to sleep in? I don't think I can sleep in here." "If you want Mr. John's family to demand their money back, you can go ahead." What money is she talking about? Jane wondered. The maid saw the shock on Jane's face and eyed her sternly. "I guess you're not aware that your family sold you to the young master for a very huge sum. Like I said, you are no different from a maid in this house. The only difference is that you're here for Mr. John's needs." Jane's eyes were suddenly teary. She knew that her parents were capable of a lot of things, but she never dreamed that they could stoop so low to sell her out. That night, Jane made up her mind to be happy regardless of everything that was coming. After washing up, she laid beside her unconscious husband, but sleep was not coming. She had always imagined her wedding night to be a very memorable one, but here she was, in bed with a lifeless man who might never see what she looked like till he dies. She kept tossing and turning in frustration, wondering why sleep was not coming. Finally, she drifted into a restless sleep and found herself engulfed in very strange dreams. When Jane woke up, her body was sore and she felt aches all over. Suddenly, she heard a loud knock on the door. The woman at the door was older than the one from last night, and she appeared more composed. She gave Jane an impatient glare. "Are you still sleeping by this time?" she asked. I didn't know I was supposed to wake up earlier," Jane stammered. "Hurry up. The rest of the family are waiting for you downstairs to serve them their breakfast." On hearing this, Jane became more shocked. The maid of last night had said that she was only contracted for Mr. John's needs alone. Why then are they demanding to be served by her? Jane quickly wiped her brows and stood up to adjust her nightdress. Downstairs, her eyes caught the wavering eyes of Mr. John's family members. They were all seated around the dining table and immediately glanced toward the staircase when they heard her footsteps. The older maid was kind enough to have brewed the tea. Jane only needed to serve it to them. She walked carefully towards the table and greeted them politely, careful not to make eye contact with any of them. They drank their tea in silence and only looked at her when she asked to take her leave. "You're now part of the family and should be here with us," said a man who Jane could tell was Mr. John's father. He looked exactly like him, but older. After speaking, he motioned for her to sit in an empty seat, directly opposite his own. Jane smiled weakly and sat down quietly, careful not to offend the others who glared at her like some sort of outcast. "Jane, I would want you to always be by Johnson's side. I would appreciate it if you took really good care of him." Jane nodded in response. His smile was contagious and had the ability to melt the hardest of hearts. He put down his teacup and said, "I will make sure that nobody treats you unfairly."
When Johnson wakes up, you both should be ready to give me a grandson.
What is he saying? Didn't they say that he only has a few months to live? When will he wake up to have a child with her? Why does he seem so confident about his recovery? After breakfast, Jane was led to the master's bedroom by Mrs. Joan. "You will have to rest now. I need to tidy up the house, and I will be back to direct you on what to do." Jane heaved a sigh of relief as Mrs. Joan closed the door behind her exiting figure. As she turned to lay on the bed, she suddenly heard a whimpering sound from the bed. As she turned, she saw him lift his hand a little. Terrified, Jane ran out of the room in haste, almost bumping into the approaching figure of Mrs. Joan. "Madam, where are you going? You were meant to stay here till I return." "I think Mr. John is awake. He moved his hand just now," Jane replied, staring at her expectantly. The woman ignored Jane and went to the bed to examine the person sleeping on the bed. Jane watched as she scoffed at how much nuisance she was causing already without knowing. "Here's Mr. John's to-do list," she said, handing the list to Jane. Jane obediently picked up the file and grinned at how much work a man in bed who was unconscious needed. From the top, Jane saw that she would have to wash him up and change his clothes early in the morning. Every one of the duties was arranged in order of their performance. "Am I supposed to bathe him by myself?" Jane asked timidly, unsure of the response she would be getting, yet wishing that the answer would be the opposite. "Of course. It's one of your duties as his wife." Truth is, Jane had never seen a naked man's body, and suddenly her cheeks flushed at the thought of seeing Mr. John's. Although he was sick, Mr. John had a breathtaking figure. Jane could tell he was handsome the night she arrived and mistakenly leaned into him while checking if he was truly unconscious as they claimed. He's indeed handsome. It's a pity she would be able to see and touch him. But he wouldn't be able to do the same, she thought to herself, somehow feeling ashamed at the direction her supposedly innocent mind was heading.
Jane was filled with anxiety as she prepared to bathe her unconscious husband, Mr. John. He lay motionless in the water, the only ripples caused by her gentle stirring. As she wiped his body, she marveled at how cold his skin felt under her palm. Suddenly, his hand moved, and she stared at him in shock. "If you're going to wake up, why don't you just do so?" she muttered. With the help of the male servants, Jane managed to get Mr. John back into bed. Exhausted from the effort, she lay down beside him, her body aching from the strain. "If you're lucky enough to survive this, you will surely reward me for all this stress," she threatened lightly. Just as she began to rest, a knock on the door interrupted her. "Madam, the boss's mother wants to see you," a voice called out. Jane frowned. The timing was terrible, as she was utterly exhausted. Despite her eagerness to meet her mother-in-law, she wished it wasn't now. In the sitting room downstairs, her mother-in-law scrutinized her as she walked in, her eyes filled with disdain. "Are you Jane? I hope you know why you're here," the woman asked. Unsure of how to respond without offending her, Jane nodded affirmatively. Her mother-in-law's words were harsh, reminding Jane that her family had sold her to them and that she was to be treated as they pleased if she ever got tired of the marriage. My son is unwell, but that doesn't mean he is dead. If I hear any rumor about you misbehaving with other men, I will make sure you are punished severely, she threatened. Why would you do that? I am still here, you know, her husband's voice interrupted. They both turned to see Mr. John's father glaring at his wife. She quickly explained herself, claiming she was only teaching Jane how to be a proper wife. Jane added that Mrs. E was instructing her on taking care of Mr. John, easing the tension. Mr. E reassured Jane, "Don't mind her strictness. I can see you are well trained, and I know our son is in good hands." Grateful for his kindness, Jane excused herself to return to her room. As she approached, she heard a voice inside. Someone was talking in low tones. "Brother, I have always admired you, but right now you're as good as dead. I don't know why they married a wife for you. What need does a dead man have for a wife?" Jane's fist clenched in anger. She pushed open the door to find a stranger choking Mr. John. "What are you doing?" she shouted, pushing the man away. The stranger let go and adjusted his clothes, glaring at her. "Who are you, and how did you get into this room?" Jane demanded. Ignoring her questions, the man introduced himself as Kennedy, Mr. John's younger brother. Jane, suspicious of his intentions, warned him not to enter the room without permission again. Kennedy smiled and approached her. "I know how lonely you must be with my brother lying hopelessly here. Why don't you come to me tonight for some fun?" Jane recoiled in disgust. "You're mad to think I would want anything to do with you," she fired back. Kennedy's smile vanished as he grabbed her arm roughly. "I've always wanted everything that belongs to my brother, including his women," he said coldly. Jane struggled, kicking him in the crotch. Enraged, Kennedy pushed her hard, causing her to fall and hit her head against her husband's. In pain, Jane's hand instinctively reached for her throbbing head. Kennedy, showing no remorse, laughed cynically at her clumsiness. But a surge of strength welled up within her, and she lunged at him. "You fool!" she seethed. "Don't you ever dare lay a hand on me again." A mysterious sound from Mr. John's bed halted their struggle. Both froze, turning to see Mr. John awakening, his eyes flickering in the dim light. Kennedy panicked and fled the room. Jane, now by Mr. John's bedside, gently touched a faint scratch on his head. To her surprise, he grabbed her hand with a firm grip. "Who are you? And what are you doing in my room?" Mr. John demanded with stern authority. I am your wife," Jane stammered, bewildered by his sudden consciousness. Mr. John released her hand, and she bolted from the room, gasping for breath. "He has finally woken up!" she screamed, alerting the household. Excitement filled the house as everyone gathered to see Mr. John awake, except for Kennedy, who struggled to fake a smile. In the sitting room, Mr. E and Mrs. E chatted happily with their son. Mr. John's gaze lingered on Jane, making her uneasy. The family doctor arrived to examine him. "I'm truly shocked at his sudden recovery. He's totally fine and would benefit from rehabilitation treatment." As the family celebrated, Kennedy attempted to leave, citing an important meeting. Mr. E was not pleased. "After all these years, your brother has just awakened, and you now wish to leave?" Kennedy stammered, explaining the arrival of foreign partners. He approached Mr. John, smiling sheepishly. "It's good to have you back, bro." Mr. John's gaze swept over everyone before resting on Jane. "Who is she? And why is she here?" And Mrs. E motioned for Jane to come closer, introducing her as Mr. John's wife. Jane felt more uncomfortable under his cold scrutiny. Later in their room, Mr. John's stern voice cut through the silence. "You do not have any business here, so get out." Jane retreated, her heart pounding. She nearly bumped into Mrs. Jones, who understood Mr. John's temper well. Jane found solace in Mrs. Jones' room that night, enjoying her most peaceful sleep since arriving at the E's family mansion. The next morning, a maid rudely awakened Jane, informing her that Mr. John had requested his breakfast. Jane followed her to the kitchen, where she was handed Mr. John's food menu. She served him, but his disdainful look was evident. "What exactly are you good at? You can't even make ordinary beef noodles," he sneered, slamming the half-eaten dish on the table. Jane, startled and humiliated, retreated to her room in tears. In the afternoon, Mr. John returned from a checkup. From afar, Jane heard shouts demanding her presence. Mr. John barged into her room, furious. "I want my room cleaned up right now," he ordered. Jane was shocked at the state of the room. It was filthy, a stark contrast to its previous neatness. Mr. John's strange smile suggested he was testing her patience. Jane remained calm and started cleaning, determined to avoid further conflict. As Jane settled into her new routine, she moved into the maid's quarters, finding relief from no longer having to care for Mr. John directly. One morning, a servant informed her that Mr. John had requested his breakfast. Jane prepared the meal, aware of his scrutiny. "Are you planning to make me serve myself?" he sneered as she approached the table. Jane dished out the food and backed away. Despite his initial disdain, he acknowledged her cooking skills with a grudging compliment. However, he quickly reverted to his harsh demeanor. After breakfast, Mr. E praised Jane, hoping she and Mr. John would give him a grandson soon. Mr. John, unimpressed, dismissed the idea, questioning Jane's suitability. Jane's heart pounded as Mr. John vented his anger. "Do you think someone like you can be my wife? You can forget about what my father said. It will never happen." He ordered her to move out of his room, making her his personal maid instead. Jane felt relieved to have her own space, even in the maid's quarters. As Jane continued her duties, she grew accustomed to Mr. John's temper. Despite the challenges, she found strength in her resilience, determined to make the best of her situation. Jane scanned the ruin caused by her supposed husband and boss. She wouldn't dare address him as her husband anymore, not since he woke up from his slumber. John could kill anyone who dares to address her as his wife. Not that she was bothered. She was better off single than staying married to a man as mean as John. But she couldn't ask for a divorce either, except John asked for it himself. She hoped and prayed that he would someday get tired of seeing her and maybe finally ask for the divorce. Jane cursed silently as she cleaned up the mess. "He's intentionally doing all of this to piss me off," she thought to herself. Satisfied with her work, she took a fake bow before strutting out of the room into the kitchen. She knew John would be demanding his lunch soon, and she didn't want his usual tantrums. Suddenly, she heard the sound of approaching footsteps and straightened herself to face whatever was coming her way. Ken stood at the door, his face beaming with smiles. "I have missed staring at your beautiful face," he said, taking in her stressed outlook. "Has my brother become too demanding again?" Jane stiffened. "I don't remember sending for you, brother-in-law," she stressed the word. Ken sneered. "Considering what almost took place between us the last time, I believe you should have a more suitable name for me." "And what exactly could that possibly be?" Jane retorted. John walked into the kitchen, gritting his teeth. His fists were clenched, triggering fear in both Ken and Jane. Ken forced a smile and stretched out his hand for a handshake. "Welcome, brother." "Actually, it was nothing. I was only trying to cheer up sister-in-law in your absence." John ignored the outstretched hand and sneered at Jane, who pretended to be busy with the cutlery on the table. The air in the kitchen became humid, despite the heater being on since 3 a.m. "I don't think Jane needs to be cheered up. She has a lot of work to keep her busy," John said, throwing a fierce gaze at Ken. Without uttering another word, Ken fled from the kitchen, leaving Jane alone to face John's scorn. "Stay away from my brother. I won't say this again," John pointed at Ken's exiting figure. Later that day, Jane decided to pay visit to her sick brother at the hospital. Jane fought back tears as the doctor ran a check on her younger brother, Jade. It was the second time she was visiting him in the hospital since she moved into John's mansion. Contrary to what her stepmother assured her, Jade's treatment was yet to be paid for. "Miss Ferdinand, we need to conduct the surgeries as soon as possible. The cancer is really eating into him," the doctor stated. After the doctor left, Jane rushed to sit beside Jade on the hospital bed. He looked frail, a shadow of the lively boy he used to be. "Sister, don't stress yourself too much, okay? I will be back home once the surgery is conducted," Jade said weakly. Jane couldn't bring herself to tell him that she was no longer in the family house, but married to a heartless man. She laid beside him, careful not to hurt him on his stitched arm. At 10, he was diagnosed with a cancerous lump on his head, which had grown, causing him constant pain. Her eyes narrowed as she thought about her mother's company, which was almost folding up. It was time to do the needful, even if it meant selling her share of the business. John couldn't understand why he constantly thought about hurting Jane. That morning, he felt a pang of an unexplainable emotion when he saw her talking with his brother in the kitchen. An unknown smile crossed his face as he visualized what his decision to divorce her would do to her. He was tired of enduring her presence. Despite his father's disapproval of the divorce, he would make Jane an offer, a very mouth-watering one, and have her do his bidding. "Sir, she's not in the villa," the maid's shaky voice announced. John's eyes roamed the sitting room before resting on her shaky form. "And who permitted her to leave?" The timid maid opened her mouth but shut it quickly, lowering her head in fear. "Tell her to see me when she returns." The servant bowed politely before scurrying away. John's presence was the worst place for anyone to be in. His cold demeanor was enough to shake anyone to their bones. Jane felt his gaze burning her skin, and it made her terribly uncomfortable. She had prepared herself for his usual bickering. As she stood transfixed to the spot, her eyes roamed the seating room until they rested on the files lying neatly on the center table. "Where did you go?" His voice was raspy yet demanding. I went to the hospital," she stammered, her shaky hands fumbling with her gown. She saw his face crease into a darker frown before it softened, but only for a moment. "Are those divorce papers?" she wondered, her mind racing. "Has he finally agreed to divorce me?" John startled her out of her reverie. "I want my car washed right now," he commanded. "But it's raining heavily," she pointed out, indicating the downpour outside. "Is that supposed to be a problem?" "Every servant understands their duties in this house," John replied coldly. Jane bit her lip anxiously. She couldn't believe what her supposed husband was asking her to do. The lightning clapped loudly, resonating around the sitting room. She took a quick glance at him before stuttering out of the room. She changed into something less decorative and prepared to wash the car, despite the heavy rain. The door creaked open and Mrs. Joan walked in, bearing a plate of pepper soup. "Here's a plate of pepper soup for you," she said. "I figured you haven't eaten anything since you left the house this morning." Jane took the plate of soup, grateful for the warmth Mrs. Joan provided since she moved into the villa. While the other maids treated her like a nobody, Mrs. Joan always took care of her like she was her own daughter. "It's okay. You need to go wash the car now before the boss starts looking for you," Mrs. Joan hinted, slowly disengaging from the hug. In the living room, John grinned as he watched Jane through the transparent door. He enjoyed seeing her struggle with the cold rain. He wanted to humiliate her until she got tired and ran out of his house, saving him the stress of a divorce that might upset his parents. Another thunderclap sent Jane running for the nearest shed in the compound. Jane knew how much John hated her, but she was scared to ask for a divorce. His family had paid handsomely for her, and although her sick brother didn't receive a dime, she knew better than to demand a divorce. She would have to pay back every single dime they spent on her family before she could be free. "I am a slave. My own family sold me under the disguise of marriage," she muttered as her tears mixed with the rain droplets. After washing the car, she wiped the rain and tears from her face and returned to her room. She changed into clean clothes and laid down to sleep, only to be woken by an icy cry from her dream. Jane rubbed her eyes vigorously. It was almost time for dinner, and she knew John wouldn't spare her if she delayed. She swayed back and forth in tiredness until she stumbled into a rigid form. Jane looked up to see John glaring at her. "What took you so long?" he demanded. I was just... Enough excuses. Prepare dinner now," he ordered. Jane nodded and hurried to the kitchen, her heart pounding. She couldn't keep living like this, but what choice did she have? John entered the kitchen, his eyes blazing with fury. "Have you suddenly become too clumsy not to see what's in front of you?" he mocked, pushing Jane off his body. She staggered before regaining her balance. "I'm sorry, sir," Jane began, but he waved her off before she could finish. "You can save your excuses for someone who has a need for them," John snapped. Jane ran towards the kitchen, suddenly feeling overwhelmed by a chilly movement around her bowel. Her mind flashed back to moments ago when she was forced to wash John's car under the rain. The sudden change in her body system could be a result of the heavy rain. Ignoring the feeling, she went ahead with the preparation for dinner. She promised herself that she would remain strong for her brother, but she suddenly felt wobbly on her legs, and before she knew it, she was lying face down on the kitchen floor. John couldn't fathom why Jane's clumsiness had increased lately. She was either bumping into people or falling down at every opportunity. Lifting her off the floor was not part of his plan. He had sworn not to have any body contact with her. Still, he couldn't believe she shared his bed while he was unconscious. However, as he glanced at her fragile form, a sudden urge to protect her was all he could feel. Her disheveled hair flustered over her face as the evening breeze breathed on her stiff form in his arms, revealing a slight cut on her forehead. She must be really delicate to have sustained an injury just by tripping. He concluded before laying her softly on her bed. "What happened to her?" John heard a familiar voice ask from the door. "Dad, I didn't know you were back already," he exclaimed happily as his father pushed the door open. "Well, you would have known if you picked your calls earlier," his dad hinted, a bit of annoyance in his tired voice. "What happened to her?" he asked again, moving closer to the bed to have a better look at Jane. John hesitated. He had never been one to lie to his dad, but right now it seemed like the best thing to do. Jane had gradually charmed his father into liking her and caring about her more than anyone else in the family. If his dad learned about what happened in his absence, he would definitely be mad at John. "I don't know. I saw her on the floor some minutes ago," he coldly admitted, running a hand through his ruffled hair. Jane's eyes fluttered open, and shock was visible on her pale face. "Is that how much you missed me in my absence?" Dad asked her as his free hand casually played with her disheveled hair. John felt something rupture inside him as a broad grin appeared on her face. He couldn't explain the open display of emotion between the duo. If he didn't know better, he would have believed that his father felt something for her. Dad noticed the way Jane recoiled in pain and asked if she was okay. She forced a smile. "I think I slipped while climbing the stairs." Dad frowned before sparing John a weary glance. "I suppose you would have done better by calling the family doctor." "What if she's in danger?" "She could be in danger for all I care," John thought. "I couldn't care less if she was hurt. I just want her out of the house and into the streets where she belongs." "I'm okay, sir." "Don't bother," Jane quickly cut in, shocking John with a smooth yet obvious lie. She was definitely a good liar, and he hoped Dad would come to see her for who she truly was. Jane tried to get up to affirm her statement, but her whole body seemed weak, and even the fake smile on her face couldn't hide this. "I'm calling the doctor immediately," Dad announced as he reached for his phone in his shirt pocket. Suddenly the door opened, revealing Madame Joan and the family doctor. "Have you felt nauseated in the past few days?" the doctor asked while examining Jane's eyes. "Yes, more often than necessary. I threw up countless times yesterday and even today," Jane admitted in a weak voice. Dad raised a brow. "Did you inform anyone about this?" "It was nothing serious. I didn't want to bother anyone," Jane replied. Dad opened his mouth to scold her, but was silenced by the doctor's next statement. "She's pregnant." John was speechless. He knew he was supposed to be excited at the news, but if she was pregnant, it would be easier to get her out of the house since he was sure the pregnancy wasn't his. "Doctor, don't you think you're too hasty with the conclusion? You should run a test on her first," John said, throwing a cold glance at Jane. All this while, Dad seemed to have a smile plastered on his face. He wouldn't blame him. It had always been his wish to have a grandchild, except that this time his joy was going to be short-lived. "What are you saying, Doctor? I have never—" Jane quickly cut herself off, not before John noticed the tiny hint of embarrassment in her voice. There was no need for the pretense. Her type was always shameless, and he was going to prove this to everyone once a proper checkup was conducted. "Have you had your period this month?" the doctor asked. Jane hesitated before shaking her head in response. "I will take a sample of her blood for the test. Be rest assured that you will get the report tomorrow," he hinted as his hands closed around the syringe in his hand. Even though Jane's period hadn't been regular, she had never considered it a major concern. The last doctor she visited had assured her it was normal for most women and encouraged her to rest more, as too much stress could be attributed to it. Even though she was worried by the constant nausea, weakness, and vomiting, she couldn't bring herself to believe she was pregnant. Her supposed husband was yet to sleep with her. She quickly scolded herself for thinking along those lines. Nothing of such would ever happen between her and John. He had told her countless times he would rather kill her than let her touch him. Aside from that, she hadn't had any prior intimacy with anyone before marrying into the Ease family. While she looked forward to giving her virginity to her husband, John would never be that husband. What if she's pregnant? Jane thought. Fred, her ex-boyfriend, was the only one who nearly had his way with her. But that was some years ago. The night Fred forced himself on her, he almost succeeded before the intervention of a stranger. Although she didn't remember the face of the stranger, he was well built like John and almost possessed the same aura. But she didn't see his face. The room Fred pushed her into before the attack was rather tiny, and she could barely make out his face in the darkness. She only remembered his scent because of the way he scooped her into his arms like she weighed nothing. While a part of John prayed for the result to be positive, his mind seemed to betray him. The familiar smell that drifted off her body when he lifted her off the kitchen floor was still evident on his shirt. It was the same smell from the other night, the same night he had the accident that left him unconscious for years. Flashback, John is seen driving towards a lonely road as he hums to a popular tune on his car stereo. He takes the next turn and realizes he had forgotten to pick up his best friend, Alan, from his house. He was supposed to have dinner with them tonight. Suddenly, he spots a hefty guy dragging a young girl into a nearby cabin while she screams and calls out for help. He would have ignored them, as he was not the type to meddle in people's affairs, but a part of him secretly wanted to help the poor girl. He quickly parks his car and follows the trail left by the big man's feet on the sticky ground. He scoffs at how badly the place looked and wonders how people survived in such a place. He peers through the open window and calculates his next action. The guy was huge too, and although John was an inch taller, he knew he wouldn't be easy to deal with. He waits until the guy pounces on the girl before bursting through the open door and hitting him with the table lamp within his reach. The girl was definitely a coward, he thought, as he scooped her into his arms. There were many objects she could use on the man to leave him dazed and allow her the opportunity to escape. But she did nothing. I will definitely teach my daughter self-defense, he concluded as he drove the unconscious girl to the nearest hospital. It was while driving back home that a driver rammed into him, resulting in his being in a coma for years. While his parents believed he was rammed into by a drunk driver, he was certain it wasn't the case. Whoever rammed into him had it all planned out. Even though Jane was certain the test result would be negative, she still felt anxious. Her whole body ached badly, and she also had a mild fever. She had been struggling to get some sleep since the doctor declared her pregnant. Suddenly, she remembered an old technique her grandma always used on her whenever she had trouble sleeping. She would try it out, hoping to get some sleep afterward. She was almost dozing off when she heard the door open, and Madame Joan was standing beside her with a package in her hands. "I got you some pain relievers for the pains and fever," Madame Joan said. Jane took the pill from her hand and was about to gulp it down with a glass of water when another wave of nausea hit her. "Are you okay?" Mrs. Joan asked. "It's nothing serious, just a little discomfort in my stomach," Jane replied. Mrs. Joan frowned. "Doesn't look so to me. Have you had your period this month?" "No, not yet," Jane responded. Mrs. Joan's face changed from a frown to a quick smile. "Madam, are you pregnant?" The water in the pill in Jane's mouth sprayed out on her body. "Mrs. Joan, like I said, it's nothing serious and I'm not pregnant. I'm only guessing. Besides, the symptoms you listed are relative to that of pregnancy," Mrs. Joan added solemnly. Jane quickly apologized for soiling her dress with water and the half-melted pill and asked for another pill. She swallowed it, then leaned against the head of the bed and dozed off. An hour later, Jane woke up to meet the prying eyes of Madame Joan. Has she been watching me sleep? She wondered. There was a package lying stylishly at the foot of her bed. "What's that?" Jane asked, pointing at the strange package. "I thought you would need this. Don't forget to use it," Madame Joan replied, passing the package to Jane's outstretched hand and turning to leave the room. Jane stopped her upon seeing the content of the package. "What's this you've brought for me?" she asked. Before Madame Joan could answer, a knock was suddenly heard on the door. "Is the young madam around? I'm here to see her." Jane recognized the voice. "Yes," she managed to answer, scared that Madame Joan would notice the rivalry between her and her so-called brother-in-law. Madame Joan opened the door and greeted the young master politely. "Good morning, sister-in-law," he greeted cheerfully. "Good morning," Jane replied weakly. Madame Joan noticed her discomfort and excused herself. She might as well get Jane a plate of soup to calm her stomachache. Kennedy's eyes left Jane's face and settled on the test kit beside her. "I didn't know my brother has had a taste of you," he blurted out. Jane frowned. "Do I owe you any explanation for whatever happens between my husband and me?" Kennedy suddenly burst into laughter. "I wonder what you saw in an unromantic jerk like my brother. He's probably in the arms of one of his numerous mistresses, and you're here bearing the pain of pregnancy alone." "You will not speak about my husband in such a manner," Jane fired back. The discomfort was increasing, and so was the weakness. She could barely raise herself off the bed, else she would have slapped Kennedy for spewing such trash in her presence. "Leave my room. I do not want to ever see you around me again." "What right do you have to ask me to leave?" Kennedy fired back. "She has every right," a cold voice rang out, leaving Jane and Kennedy stunned. John's constant rivalry with Jane was beginning to get to him. He might not want her for a wife, but he couldn't stand her having anything to do with his younger brother. "Brother, I came by to see how my sister-in-law is faring. Heard she's sick," Kennedy admitted between a throaty cough. John eyed him in disdain. "Are you going so soon? Are you done seeing my wife?" Kennedy gave a weary smile. "Of course, I was about to leave." John lowered the jar of water in his hand on the table beside Jane. "Why don't you continue the discussion you were having before I came in?" Jane shook her head repeatedly. "I would prefer to be left alone." "I insist." Kennedy's eyes scanned the room before resting on John's angry face. "Brother, I need to catch up with an urgent meeting," he said, showing the obvious message on his phone screen. John's face creased into a frown, and his Adam's apple pulsated heavily as he swallowed hard. The doctor was yet to return with the test result. It was very unlike him to delay providing results to any member of the E family. John was anxious to get the result and have Jane thrown out of the house by his father himself. He would be highly disappointed in her, he thought, as a slight smile crossed his face. In the dining room, John stared at his untouched food. He found it difficult to eat anything other than what Jane cooked. Jane was a good cook, but he would never admit it, not to Jane or any other person. Suddenly, Madame Joan approached the dining table in a haste. "Young master, Madame has become terribly sick." "Terribly sick?" John thought. Was she pretending to be sick to avoid doing her duties? "Young master, I think she needs to be taken to the hospital," Madame Joan said. John sighed before covering his untouched food. "It's just a minor fever. She doesn't need to be taken to the hospital," he asserted coldly. Madame Joan shook her head repeatedly. "She's been vomiting too, and has refused to eat anything since yesterday. Moreover, she took care of you when you were in a coma." "You're obviously overstepping your boundaries," John warned. Dad wasn't the only one Jane had won over with her charms. Madame Joan had also been caught in her web. As the oldest servant in the house, she was one of the most caring. But with Jane, it was more than usual. She treated Jane with so much reverence, not because she was John's supposed wife, but because she truly cared about her. John couldn't pretend to eat the food anymore. The food wasn't bad. He could tell from the aroma, but his appetite was gone, and he blamed Jane for it. "Young master, the doctor is here," one of the servants said as she stuttered into the dining room. Some hours earlier, Jane had gotten up from the bed. Her mouth had gone dry and her tongue parched from the constant fever. She stretched out her hand for the cup of water on the table, her eyes rolling immediately as another pang of nausea hit her. Even if she threw up, she was sure there was nothing left in her stomach. She hadn't eaten anything, and her nausea wasn't making it easy for her to eat something. So much had taken place in her body since the day John woke up. She had blamed it on the constant errands he kept her busy with. But now she was almost certain that assumption wasn't true. After calming herself down, she saw the package Madame Joan had brought in earlier. It was lying neatly beside her bed, and the pregnancy test kit caught her attention. She decided to carry out a test. There was no harm in trying since the test kit was already there. Inside the bathroom, her heart skipped repeatedly as she beheld the change in the color of the strip. "I can't be pregnant," she stuttered. "This can't possibly be true," she thought. "It must be some fake product," she finally concluded nervously. She packed up the evidence and flushed it down the toilet. She would figure out a lie to tell Madame Joan when she eventually asked for the test strip. Jane quickly took out her phone and dialed the doctor's number. He was kind enough to have left his number with her the previous day. After a moment, he picked up and responded cheerfully. "Madam, you called just in time to get the good news. Just like I suspected, you're 3 months pregnant," he announced. Jane went silent, unsure of how to respond. There was no way the test strip and the doctor could both be wrong. She was actually pregnant. "My husband will be happy to hear about this," she said, pretending to be happy. "But I don't want anyone to know about this yet, doctor. Can you keep this a secret for now?" she pleaded. The doctor was alarmed. He wasn't used to such reactions and wondered why. "Your husband has asked for the result. I was actually getting ready to see him today with the result. I really want to surprise him myself," she explained. "Please, can you lie to him for now?" The doctor knew how brutal John could be. He confirmed this in his dealings with him before the accident. He knew that he could lose his life for playing a costly prank on him. As if she read his thoughts, she quickly stepped in with quick assurance. "I will tell him when the time comes, and I will make sure he doesn't get angry at you." He gave a sigh of relief. If she was sure of what she said, he would be happy to help her out. Moreover, it wouldn't be a totally bad thing to toy with the almighty Johnny's emotions. "Of course, I will help you," he replied. Later that day, Madame Joan opened the door and entered the dimly lit room she shared with Jane. They had quickly lied to John's father when he asked why Jane was sleeping in the maid's quarters instead of in the master's bedroom with her husband. "The young master won't be able to take proper care of her in her current condition," she had said. Seeing Jane still on the bed with her eyes closed, Madame Joan quietly approached her. If nobody cared enough about the young madam, it was her duty to nurse her back to health. "Madame Joan, you're back?" Jane asked as she stirred in her sleep. "Young madam, I brought some soup for you. It will help tame the nausea." Jane couldn't understand why the young madam was not taken to the hospital yet. Her boss seemed like he had no empathy for his wife. "I do not want to eat anything, Madame Joan. I just want to visit the hospital. I overheard the young master talking to someone in the living room. I think it's the family doctor." Jane's heart skipped, and she gripped the bedhead post for support. What if he told John the truth about her pregnancy? "I was about to call you right now," John said, stretching out his hand to the doctor for a handshake. "That makes 2 of us," the doctor replied cheerfully. "I have lots of patients to attend to, so I might as well get going," he said, handing John a white envelope containing the test result. John released a cocky smile. He was finally going to send Jane out of the house without his father's interruption. He was about to open the envelope when a servant sauntered into the living room to tell him that his father was waiting for him in his study room. His father was used to calling him into the study room when he had something very important to discuss. John quickly tucked the letter into his back pocket as he made for the study room. "Have a seat, John. I have been waiting for you," his father said. John tried to calm his wayward nerves. The last time his father called him into the study room, it was to remind him of his place as the heir of the E family. Now he was anxious about the reason his father sent for him. "So I have been thinking, since your wife is now pregnant, won't it be nice if you 2 went on a vacation?" "Dad, how are you so sure about this?" As much as he wanted the result to be positive, he also feared it could be a mere assumption. Bringing out the white envelope from his pocket, John flipped it open, revealing the typed document bearing his supposed wife's test result. His eyes scanned the content until it rested on the portion that boldly affirmed that his wife's pregnancy test turned out to be negative. "How come," he voiced aloud, forgetting that his father was in the study room with him. His father peered at him with concern. "What happened?" "She's not pregnant," John said, dropping the test result on his father's outstretched palm. The father took a fierce look at the paper in his hand before lifting his face to stare at John's angry expression. "I thought you didn't want a child badly. Why are you so bothered by this?" the puzzled father asked, handing the piece of paper back to John. "Shouldn't you be in a merry mood right now?" he questioned. John couldn't bring himself to unveil the reason for his anger. His father had clearly misunderstood his sudden outburst. John had planned how he was going to send Jane back to her wretched family, whose lives revolved around money. Even though he wasn't conscious when the payment was made, his mother had informed him that his father paid her family hugely for her hand in marriage. He was not about to blow his cover and expose his plans to his father. So he admitted to his father's earlier claim and was rewarded with a warm pat on the shoulder. "Don't worry, I'm sure she will get pregnant soon," his father said. John's face went bright red at the mention of the word pregnancy. His father might as well continue in his dream of him having a grandchild with Jane. Since John couldn't divorce her because of his father, he might as well agree to the trip proposed by his father. On the way, he would scare her into running away from him and agreeing to a divorce. He might even pay her off. She was from a gold-digging family, and he was sure she wouldn't be any different from her parents who sold her off. But before then, he would ask his driver to take her to the hospital for treatment. It would be difficult to take her on the trip while she was very sick. A tap on his shoulder jolted him out of his reverie. He turned to behold the mocking gaze of his mother. "You didn't tell me you were coming," he said excitedly, enveloping her in a firm hug. He had clearly missed spending time with his mom. He was always hopeful that she and his father would settle their differences. "Do I need permission to visit my own house again?" the bemused woman asked, touching him lightly on the cheek. "Of course not. I just wasn't expecting you anytime soon," he replied, smiling sheepishly at how much she could crack him up easily. "Mom, don't you think you're aging backward?" he teased her. She burst into loud laughter, taking a quick turn and boldly flaunting her beautiful gown and matching pair of stilettos. "My future wife will come to you for some classes." The stunned mother abruptly stopped to glare at him. "What did you say? What about Jane?" He scoffed at the mention of Jane's name. "She's Dad's new wife." Jane's mind seemed to drift to her poor brother in the hospital. She was yet to see him since the last time she visited him. Her earlier fear was suddenly getting magnified. If John found out about her pregnancy, he would divorce her, and her chance of selling her shares to him wouldn't be possible. She muttered a silent prayer, her eyes slowly meeting with Madame Jones' concerned look. "Madam, what's the problem? You look worried," she asked. "When will the young master leave the house?" Jane asked with the hope of leaving for the hospital where Liam, her brother, was kept. Madame Jones looked at the direction of the door before answering. "He will be leaving in the next few minutes. His driver is here already." Jane felt relieved. His absence would make it easier for her to leave the mansion. "Can I trust you to cover up for me in my absence?" "I will cover for you, young madam," Madame Jones promised. Jane was suddenly overwhelmed by emotions. Not only had Madame Jones been good to her, but she was also taking the risk of covering up for her. "Madame Jones, I promise to take you out of here once I become wealthy," she said as soon as Madame Jones asked to go back to her duties in the kitchen. Her promise didn't make any sense to her. It felt like a promise made by an infant desperate for his mom's attention. Jane waited till the young master had driven off the mansion before she stuttered to the gate alongside Madame Jones. She knew it would be impossible to step out of the gate without her assistance. The guards were more conversant with Madame Jones than with her. "Where are you both going?" the guard asked, raising an eyebrow. "We need to pick up some groceries from the stores," Madame Jones replied. Although Jane was the young madam of the home, she was not entirely treated as one, and that's because her supposed husband had chosen to reduce her to his personal maid instead of his wife. The guards on duty were a new set and didn't look like they knew her. They were probably yet to see the wife of their young master. Jane tugged lightly at her scarf covering her face, revealing only a part of her eyes. "Who's she?" the guard asked, pointing at Jane. "She's my younger sister," Madame Joan answered. The guard took a fierce glance at them before waving them through the gate. While outside, Jane ordered a ride, and they waited patiently until the car pulled up beside them on the pedestrian walkway. At the hospital, the doctor looked at her brother's test report before asking her to see him in his office. "I have some bad news for you," he said. The thought of the worst scenario flashed through her mind. "Really?" she forced herself to ask. "Yes, but I might be able to remedy the situation if you're willing to cooperate." After struggling to calm her nerves, she looked up to meet the doctor's flirty eyes peering down at her. "What do you mean?" she stuttered, suddenly feeling uncomfortable being alone with him in his office. "Jane, why are you acting so difficult? You know I care about you." She wanted to cry out in frustration. She was thinking about saving her dying brother, and this despicable doctor was looking for a way to sleep with her. Picking up the glass of water on his table, she swiftly emptied the contents on his white coat. "Go to hell," she fired as she marched out of the office to meet the bemused face of her supposed husband at the door. "Don't you have a thing for harassing all the men you come across? How dare he accuse her of harassing the doctor when in actual sense he was the one trying to hit on her?" She opened her mouth to speak, but he motioned for her to keep quiet. "Better have a good reason for leaving the house without my permission," he sternly warned before knocking on the door, the same door she had just come out from. Jane was extremely nervous. What had she gotten herself into? She ran into her brother's ward to check on him. He was lying face up and was bare from his waist upward. Although he was fast asleep, his eyes suddenly lit up on feeling her presence inside the room. He managed to release a smile before his eyelids opened. His face looked paler than how it was the last time she visited. "Why haven't you visited since the last time?" he asked weakly, releasing a cough. She didn't want to tell him that she was sick and still is sick. The news would worry him. She couldn't also tell him that she was busy. He would assume she's become too busy for him. Rather, she came up with a more thoughtful lie. "I was raising money for your surgeries," she replied. John was sure he had given stern warnings to his guards not to allow her or any of his servants to leave the house without his permission. His chief security officer stood a foot away, with his head bent like a criminal about to be hanged. "I want you to get me a report of who allowed her out of the house without my permission," John boasted slowly before sauntering out of the room. "I'm sorry for leaving the house without your permission," Jane said. He had planned to punish her for disobeying him, but as he stared at her fragile frame in front of him, he suddenly felt the need to protect her instead. "What were you doing at the hospital?" he suddenly asked after a momentary silence. "I went to check on my sick brother." She had prepared herself for the worst. She might as well ask him for a divorce before he decided to punish her with it. "I want to ask for a divorce," she stuttered. "You want a divorce?" John sneered, suddenly feeling overwhelmed by her admission. "It's good you finally understood your place in my life. When did you suddenly come to this decision?" She tugged at the hem of her dress. Her heart felt heavier than when she ran into him at the hospital. "I guess I'm not worthy of being your wife, like you've always said. At least you can now opt for a lady who fits your prestige." Beaming with smiles, John fought the urge to circle her into his arms. "I'm glad you're really saying this. I would admit that you're very bold. Coming to me to ask for a divorce speaks so much of how bold you are." Aside from her cooking skills, which he found to be excellent, she was quite annoying. Since she started preparing his dishes, he had not tasted any other food and found it to be tasty. "I will grant you the divorce you seek once Dad returns, but Madame Jones said he traveled again and will only return next month." "Well, you're right. He has gone for a business trip and will only return next month." Jane was worried. Asking for a divorce was the easiest way to escape the mansion before her pregnancy bump became visible. Next month would leave her at the risk of getting exposed. Staying longer in the villa would leave her at their mercy and at the peak of scandalous news headlines since her wedding to John was broadcasted nationwide. "Why don't we get a court approval first? We can always explain to Dad when he returns from his trip." John was shocked and puzzled at the same time. It was true that he felt repulsed by her presence. But he wasn't willing to let her go, at least not yet. He didn't seem to understand why she was eager to divorce him all of a sudden. Could it be that there was something up her sleeve and she was demanding a divorce to cover it up? Why should I agree to your proposal? How dare you negotiate with me? Wasn't our marriage without your permission? Isn't this what you've always wanted? I call the shots. I make the decisions too. Back in her room, Jane tossed and turned as sleep left her. It wasn't bedtime yet, but she was still feeling weak and needed to rest her head a little. The door suddenly came open, and Madame Jones skipped into the room bearing a plate of food. "Madam, you're back so soon. How was what you went for?" "I had some drugs prescribed for me," Jane said, showing the wrap pack beside her on the bed. "The doctor thinks I have a cold." "That's a relief. I thought it was something more. At least a cold will definitely go away after some days," Madame Jones quickly added. Jane could have felt relieved except that she wasn't down with a cold. She was pregnant, and the weirdest thing was that she didn't want to believe it. But who could be responsible for her pregnancy? John would find out whatever secret she was hiding. The first time he mentioned divorce to her, she was jittery. Now she's the one proposing it. He picked up his phone and dialed an unknown number. "I want you to monitor my wife's every movement from now henceforth." Madame Jones handed Jane some chunks of dried meat. "Madam, here's for you." Jane recoiled as another wave of nausea hit her. Madame Jones was suddenly terrified. "Madam, are you sure this is just a cold?" "My stomach aches. Although I have had my medications already, I think it's one of the side effects of the medication." Madame Jones didn't see the need to get more suspicious anymore. She believed her. "I am getting overly worried now." The morning sickness would persist, and soon her secret would be open to all. Before sleeping that night, Jane made some silent prayers before digging out an ancient book about women in pregnancy. She opened the first pages and began reading with great interest. The first pages were on early signs of pregnancy. As she read with keen attention, her mind slowly delved to her childhood days, when she was forced to stay with her grandmother during holidays. Her grandmother was a great medicine woman who derived so much joy in treating people for the tiniest amounts. She was notable for using unusual techniques to treat illnesses. Although Jane was young to understand these things, she was proud of her grandmother and her rare abilities to help people in need. She totally blamed herself for not picking interest in her grandmother's career. Maybe she would have been quite established, just like her grandmother was. Her grandma's words still rang a bell in her ears. "If you learn a little about my work, you will equally be respected in the future," she had always told her, while patting her slowly on the shoulder. Well, maybe the work was rather too stressful that she didn't see the need to have the slight interest in it. But she was kind enough to give her this ancient book as a farewell gift, and she was really grateful for it. She suddenly smiled as she came to a particular page that seemed to have what she was looking for. Following the instructions in the book, she carefully picked up a needle and was about to plunge it into her flesh when the door burst open. "Madam, what are you doing?" Madame Jones asked, concern written all over her face. Startled, Jane dropped the needle and looked up to meet her gaze. "It's nothing, ma'am. It's just an ancient method for dealing with stomach upsets." Madame Jones' face suddenly lifted into a warm smile. "Of course, I know it. I'm shocked to see that you also know it." Beaming with smiles, Jane announced proudly, "Well, it's some of the tricks I picked up from my grandma." She didn't mean to tell lies, but she was glad that the fake grin on her face didn't sell her off. She slowly pushed the book into her duvet, careful not to expose the title to Madame Jones' full glare. If John dared to find out that she was pregnant, she was sure she wouldn't be leaving the mansion as a complete piece. She smoothly inserted the needles into her belly. After a while, she felt relieved. It was unexpectedly effective, but she couldn't say if it would also be able to deal with the morning sickness. "I think I'm feeling hungry now," she happily announced, throwing her hands into the air. Madame Jones was overly happy. It was the first time Jane was requesting food since her illness started. She juggled out of the room excitedly before Jane changed her mind. The method had always proven to be quite effective. She had tried it before now, and it worked perfectly well. But she wasn't sure if it would also be able to save her in this case. Soon, Madame Jones was back with a plate of cake and a glass of orange juice. The smell of the cake didn't nauseate her like most foods did. She slowly picked a piece and chewed noisily on it until her eyes caught Madame Jones' thin smile. "My manners," she jokingly admitted. "I do not chew food this noisily." Touching her lightly, Madame Jones replied, "You don't have to apologize. I'm glad you're finally having the appetite for something." The room was suddenly calm with no sound from either her or Madame Jones. The only sound was the one coming from her moving lips as they closed in and out on the tasty cake Madame Jones gave her. Taking the last bite of the cake, she exhaled deeply before adjusting her glance to the woman beside her. "Madam, do you have any family?" "Of course I have a family. I have a husband and a teenage son." Jane's eyes lit up excitedly on hearing about her son. "How was his delivery? Did he disturb you so much?" It was as if the older woman had been expecting her to ask about this long before now, because she was suddenly ecstatic while giving her details. "You know, I actually didn't find out in time when I took in for him. He was clearly the best thing that has ever happened to me. Although I was young, I never attributed the usual early sickness and throwing up to pregnancy. I thought I was down with the flu." "Really?" "Yes, I was young and naive, and my parents were late." Jane shook her head in pity and patted the older woman slightly on her arm. "I'm really sorry about the death of your parents. It must have been difficult living life without them." "Yes, it was," she admitted, wiping her face as a stray tear found its way down. "I found out about my pregnancy in the 3rd month." Jane quickly calculated her own pregnancy from the test results. She would almost be over 3 months when John's father would be returning from his trip. She wouldn't dare stay in the house till then. She would go back to John and insist on the divorce. It was the only way to leave the house without being shamed by the Ease family, who derived so much joy in shaming people who were not up to their class and yet wanted to have anything to do with them. In order to keep Jane within his reach and not loitering around, John decided to take her with him for his physiotherapy sessions with his doctor. He was done with the session and his eyes scanned the empty room for a sign of her. Was she so fond of walking about? Just some minutes ago, she was there staring at him in the most insane way, and now she was nowhere to be found. The door suddenly opened and there she was, her innocent face clearly betraying her true nature. "Where did you go?" I was in the restroom," she stuttered, her eyes straying from his feet to his unclad chest. Although she had seen him naked before while she bathed him in his unconscious state, he was stretched to his full height now, and she could barely look him in the face without standing on her toes. "What are you staring at?" he bellowed. Her face suddenly flushed when she realized that he had caught her staring. "Nothing," she muttered, slowly bending her head to stare back at his feet. "I want my shoes back on my feet." The doctor had advised him not to do any strenuous thing. Bending was not part of such things, but he was always looking for every opportunity to belittle her. She quickly ran to where he stood and bent to help him with his shoes. Her shaky hands seemed to be noticed by him. "What's with the delay? Are you so incompetent that you can't buckle ordinary shoes?" "I'm having a hard time with it, sir." Shoving her off, he bent to wear the shoes. "I should have known that you're useless," he fired. She was about to scurry away when she heard a squirm followed by a loud thud. He was lying face down, his knee bent in a painful way. The scene was both funny and awkward. She was almost tempted to laugh at him, but it could lead to her death. She instinctively went to help him up. He was mad when she failed to buckle his shoes properly. Even his 2-year-old niece knew how to do it. He had pushed her off to do it himself when he suddenly felt himself crashing to the floor. Ashamed and defeated, he had chosen to lie still till he regained his strength. But there she was beside him, pretending to care. "Are you going to help me? Or would you rather watch me do it like you did with the shoes?" he coldly asked. He enjoyed the play of fear on her face.